Hi there, everyone. Welcome to a special edition right here on Converge Media. I am your host, Trea, and with me today, joining me in studio, is someone who has really shown up and shown out for the mental health community right here in Seattle, Miss Ashley McGirt. Thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for that acknowledgement of my body of work, and I'm always happy to be here.
You know, to be honest, this is a topic that we knew we had to breach right here on Converge. It's something that really has been wrecking our community, and today we're talking about suicide. I think that we've seen COVID do a lot of wrecking of lives in general, and suicides actually don't get talked about enough in the Black community. And so I really want to start off with your expertise with regard to suicide, your background, and why you're actually one of our experts in this regard.
Yeah, so my master's research was actually on African American suicide, and it's important to really acknowledge that suicide is the third leading cause of death for African American male youth, and we don't talk about it. And it's interesting now with COVID because we're seeing an increasing amount of depression and mental health concerns. But the CDC actually reported that suicide rates have gone down for the first time in history since 1999 by about 2.1%. So it'll be interesting to see how those numbers are impacted and changed as more research and more numbers come out due to all of the things that we're seeing due to the coronavirus.
Well, yeah, because I think sometimes there's measures in terms of the ways that lived experience and data differ a bit. Can you elaborate on that? Because you're talking about some of the things that I'm seeing a lot of folks in terms of isolation right now that really does drive a lot of the depressing mechanisms that can cause suicide.
Exactly. So a lot of the signs and symptoms that we normally see for suicidality and suicide, we're seeing just because of the conditions that COVID has placed on us. For instance, we are social beings. We were put on this earth with other people, not by ourselves, and now we're being forced to isolate, which that's antithetical to how we were created. And now we're seeing isolation, increased substance abuse. People are at home using drugs, drinking, some of the things that we would see with suicide symptoms. And it's especially exacerbated if you have a history of depression, or we'll see blatant things where people are actually talking about dying more, death. We're seeing increased death, especially with slain Black bodies being showcased day in and day out. So we're seeing a lot of these things.
You know, this is the part for me that I think is so imperative, and why I really wanted to be a part of this is because we, in families, a lot of the times, particularly in the Black community, there is really a shame almost that comes with it when a family member has chosen to end their own life. And I have this personal lived experience of it, but I really want to hear from you before I get into my personal story. I really want to hear from you with regard to how that plays out, particularly in the Black community, with regard to the shame that then is felt by those who are left over.
When it comes to the Black community, what I see is we don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to say what it was that led that person to harm themselves, or how they died. We'll say they passed or they went on. We don't actually say they completed suicide and that was the cause of their death. We keep it within our inner circle and we don't talk about it. We don't share our stories because there's so much guilt. And a lot of that is survivor's guilt, which guilt is really just a way that we grieve. So oftentimes when we're grieving, we have guilt about, I should have done this, I could have done this, I wish I would have done this, and I could have ultimately saved that person's life. But that's a false reality, because either way, that thing would have occurred. There's things that we could have put in place, but when you hold that and you carry it, it just leads to, increased anxiety, depression. So what I would encourage for our community, especially the Black community, is to talk about it more. Share your experiences. Yes, there's somebody that I know who completed suicide. There's a family member, or even share that you suffered yourself from suicidality, because research actually shows that from the age of 6, we begin to have thoughts of not wanting to be here, not wanting to be on earth. So plenty of people have suffered from this. I personally, there have been times in my life when my grandmother passed and I didn't want to live, and I didn't understand why God would take the most important person in my life away from me. It's actually why I do this work, because when I did start talking about the feelings that I was having, my family and my community just said, pray about it. Don't talk about it. Don't say anything like that. God is going to be upset that you are thinking about not being here, or that you are upset with God. Just keep that to yourself. And what keeping that to myself did at 9 years old was create a decade of depression that could have been addressed a lot sooner than that. So I really just encourage people to have these conversations and not minimize people's feelings or experiences, or just say, just pray, or you have so much to live for. Why are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of people that, and I don't know if it's just one religion or another. I was raised Christian, so that's what I know most, right? Yeah. But there's a lot of folks that feel like they are being genuine and being sincere when they uplift, God, or uplift religion or spiritual belief or practice with regard to depression in particular. And I've seen that in the Black community, even when we deal with, how pressures from the outside world, whether that be school, job, whatever relationships, of the opposite sex, or, if you're in same-sex marriage or same-sex relationship, that when you deal with breakups or things like that, strain in that relationship, there's a lot of different factors that actually filter in and funnel in and create depressive mind states. From your expertise, a lot of times those things are not also talked about in regard to shoring up our health to be able to withstand those kind of blows that we all really experience in life.
Yeah. And it's because we are not sharing that we experienced those blows. We're not sharing how we overcame those blows, or, hey, I lost a job and this is what I did to get through that grief and those losses. And now with COVID, we're all experiencing some form of loss. We have 50 million people currently unemployed, waiting for a $600 stimulus check. So there's a lot of mental health stressors right there, especially when we're looking at financial stressors. And we don't share. We don't share when we're struggling financially. We don't share when we're struggling intimately, personally. We don't want to put that out. And so our social media is all a facade of glitz and glamour. And there's a thin line, because sometimes, people are overly sharing and it's like, well, you're attention seeking, or all of these negative things that come out about how you present yourself. But it's important to find safe spaces where you can open up and you can share what worked for you, especially in the Black community. And I'm a therapist, so I'm always going to advocate for therapy, but Indigenous people have found ways to heal before Sigmund Freud stepped on the scene, before any evidence-based practices were around. Our people danced, they stood on the ground, grounding themselves to the soil and this earth for which we're a part of. So there's plenty of ways in which we can heal and we can support one another. But the big thing is we really need to eliminate the shame and the guilt that is associated with suicide, and talk about it more, and get rid of this mistaken belief that talking about suicide is going to encourage someone to complete suicide, because that's not true.
Numbers don't support it.
At all. know, and then in our community, it's interesting because we grapple with this duality between are suicides in our community actually real, or is it the white community who is actually creating this mistaken notion that we left this world dying by suicide, because we know situations like Sandra Bland and other individuals who have been made out to look as if they completed a suicide, and then the Black community is like, no. So then when an actual suicide occurs, we have difficulty within our community actually reconciling that was actually how they left this earth. And the reality is we can hold up too. There are the Sandra Bland situations. There are the situations where individuals are made out to have killed themselves when they didn't. And there's the reality that Black men, Black youth are killing themselves at high rates, Black women too. So we can uphold that, as well as the LGBTQI community within the Black culture that are killing themselves. So we can honor both of that and find ways to heal.
Yeah, I think that, something you mentioned there really strikes me, because what I'm really hearing is a thorough line about vulnerability. I mean, we talk about Black folks being so strong, even in the medical field. There's these disparities around the treatment of, Black mothers that are going through childbirth versus white. There's been so many disparities in terms of the strength that we must have in our melanin skin, that it was tougher. So many myths, medical myths that have had to be debunked over many generations and many decades with regard to the strength of Black people. So the idea is that, hey, Black people are stronger, they can take on more, they can do more, also results in people in the community then being like, you know what, I gotta be strong. I can't show my vulnerability. I can't show that this is hurting me or that this is harmful. And that has actually exacerbated a lot of these issues, right?
Exactly. And there's actually so much strength, since we're talking about being strong, being the strong Black woman, man, or however you identify. There's strength in vulnerability. There's strength in acknowledging, hey, I need help. Hey, I'm having a hard time. There is so much strength in that. And it's interesting, the things that you talk about, because I remember seeing back in the day how they would use a certain type of bullet on Black peoples, because they felt as though Black people could withstand gunshots. So they used a certain type of bullet, and I can't think of the name right now, but it was interesting that they felt we had these super strength powers that we could withstand an actual bullet to the flesh, that they had to use a different type of a bullet in order to shoot us. And honestly, what that does is that kills us. And that's why Black people are experiencing chronic stress-related illnesses and dying at disproportionate rates. And part of it is due in part to our mental health. Chronic stress-related illnesses mean you're stressed out. You're having chronic heart failure, diabetes, strokes. The leading cause of strokes is literally stress. And we're not talking about these things. My grandmother died at 62 years old from a stroke. She was extremely stressed out. She didn't go to therapy. There was probably no Black culturally responsive clinician available to her during those times. She was raising her grandchildren, dealing with racism, being an educator, so many different things that came into play that ultimately led to her leaving this earth at 62 years of age, which is highly, highly problematic. We should not be dying at that age.
Well, when you talk about stress, I mean, there's so much evidence that goes into two things that come to mind for me, for our communities to really begin to understand and educate themselves with regard to how stress plays out in their lives. And I think there is a large amount of Black women who actually carry around fibroids because of the stress. We talk about that there's actual issues that stress causes. And there's ways to prevent that stress. And so there's a couple of things that I think about with that. When we think about the ways that our community has needed healing, we talk about healing in a wide variety of ways. And mental healing is definitely one of them. When in so many different platforms, understanding how even gentrification plays on the mind, right? We've seen this. We've seen that uprootedness also take effect with regard to a lot of the stress mechanisms that are then felt in the body. And so now a lot of folks are coming out to showcase, hey, this is how ancestrally we did this. This is how we dealt with it. And to kind of go back a little bit, how do you feel in terms of that incorporating of maybe, things that are not really from Western science, but that then begin to incorporate a more holistic view with regard to dealing with stress so that all of those kind of stress-related illnesses can then be diminished?
Yeah, I believe and I support it 1,000%. But at the end of the day, I'm also licensed by the state of Washington, so I am upheld by a certain set of laws and restrictions to where I have to follow evidence-based practices. So I have to get really creative in my approaches when I'm treating my clients, and I'm looking at, okay, this serve indigenous people well. So how can I incorporate this in my practice and bring it into maybe CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and adding in mindfulness techniques and other elements of dance or movement, because I'm all about healing the body. We're resilient people, and we're continuing to just get through blow after blow of all of these things that we go through, but our bodies don't. And our bodies know, hey, we need to pause. So I'm constantly assessing my clients and myself. Like, I do a head to toe assessment every day. How is my head feeling all the way down to the bottom of my feet? Because our bodies will let us know. Your head will start hurting, your neck, all of these different things are occurring. That's really important for us as Black people, as people of color, indigenous people, to really look at our bodies and find out what is it telling us. So yeah, when it comes to being a licensed therapist under the body of the state of Washington and hopefully California soon, and maybe some other states, trying to get those licensing, we just have to be really creative and advocate for policies to change, advocate for all of these things to be recognized that have served people, again, before psychology was a thing. Before mental health was a word. What were our people doing to heal? Because they were doing things. So how do we look at those practices? Maybe they didn't go through a whole chain of body and have dissertations written on them and all of these things, but they served our people well. But yeah, for me, it's a fine line if I'm going to be billing insurance or treating clients under the state in which, I've received my license. So just being mindful of that. But there's creative ways around it, things that aren't necessarily clinical.
Well, before we go to break, our first break, I just want to ask, because what I'm seeing out there in community is so many different types of solutions, right? And I even, in some of our health and wellness calls, we've been hearing how folks are like, look, because I want to incorporate these Eastern practices or incorporate this holistic vision, I don't even do, this type of insurance, or I don't do this or that, right? And so I just want to ask you, in terms of your professional expertise and how you've been seeing the sector of mental health in a medical way, how folks are actually embracing that. Just like you said yourself, are you seeing an increase in clinicians of color taking on some of these ideals into their practice the ways that they can, kind of how you just described for yourself?
I'm seeing an increase in clinicians of colors taking on these practices, but separating it from their business. So like, I have a therapist friend who also does Reiki on the side, but her Reiki is a Reiki business. So she's very distinct in that you're coming to me for Reiki here, or you're coming to me for therapy here, and this is what therapy looks like. I have therapist friends who also do acupuncture or other practices that we know help heal. I've personally been suffering from migraines, and acupuncture has helped me tremendously. So I know that these things work either through my own lived experiences or the testimonies of others. I haven't added those things to my practice, but just from what I've seen is a separation. A lot of therapists also are becoming coaches, so they're under the umbrella of a life coach. Or a specific type of coach, whatever coaching they're doing, and then they have these other practices, and oftentimes they separate their business. But yeah, plenty of people are being creative, and we have to, because there's more than one way to heal.
Yeah, period. And I think if the end goal is really about healing, then it is important to not just be getting it from one source or another, or to only be thinking about, hey, this is what I learned in school and this is all I can apply to it. I think also too, because therapists and mental health professionals are really looked up to as experts within the community. A lot of this stuff, again, as we just described early on, is that it's not widely discussed in community. Yeah. And so when we see a rise in, Black practitioners and those that, okay, you look like me, you maybe we had similar lived experience, yeah. Right? It really brings the guard down a little bit, but then there also probably have other questions that need to be answered. So it's great to hear that. And I'm happy that we're having this discussion. You guys stay tuned with us. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone out there. Thank you for tuning in. If you guys know of anyone who is suffering from any of the symptoms that have been described in the special, or anybody who is suffering depression, having suicidal thoughts, there are definitely resources available out there. The National Prevention for Suicide has a hotline, 1-800-273-TALK. That is 1-800-273-8255. They are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Please share this resource with a friend, a family member, a neighbor, so suicide can be prevented.
I did it for the city, I did it for the love, I did it for the people, I did it for us. Back on this rap-ish, I ain't even broke a sweat, homie, this practice. Pondering my next move, staring at my track list, hope I ain't miss my window. Praying like a Baptist, Seattle's own, tired of this Game of Thrones. They made a list of the best rappers and guess who wasn't on? While the disrespect continues, I'm steady packing these venues.
Converge Media produces culturally relevant content for Black and urban audiences. Our coverage is raw, transparent, and objective, praised by community leaders, government officials, and residents. Support Converge Media today via Venmo, CashApp, or PayPal at Converge Media. Welcome back, everybody, to this special edition right here on Converge Media. I am Trea Holiday, and with me today is Miss Ashley McGirt, MSW right here, who's been doing phenomenal work in the community once again. And thank you, because that first segment, it really lays out a lot of different things in terms of the state of suicide right now and how it's actually felt in community. One of the things I want to ask is, what are some of the signs that are really prevalent in terms of suicide prevention, almost, that people and families can do when they see a loved one struggling?
Yeah, so some of the most blatant signs that you can look for when someone's suffering from suicidality is them mentioning that they want to kill themselves or they want to harm themselves. That's one of the most blatant things. Also, when individuals begin to start selling some of their most prized possessions or just giving them away. Isolating, which that's kind of difficult to discern right now because we're all in a state of isolation. Individuals who have a history of depression are more prone to experience suicidality or complete suicide. Seeing individuals increasing their substance use, things like that. Individuals who engage in risky behaviors. Mm-hmm. So for men, oftentimes it's having multiple sexual encounters. Oftentimes that's a sign of their depression or that they're engaging in risky behaviors. They're not using protection. Mm-hmm. So that could lead to a whole host of different things, but they just don't care at that point. Also for men, especially Black men, sometimes we see things like speeding, driving fast. So engaging in just unsafe behaviors on the road that could ultimately lead to ending your life. Sometimes we see things like, suicide by cop or suicide by gang or different things. Those are going to be blatant signs, but oftentimes really just paying attention to someone's mood and their affect, because, individuals will say, hey, I'm fine and I'm okay, but that affect says something completely different. And knowing the type of person, what did they used to engage in? Again, difficult to discern right now because some of their normal activities that they engaged in may be shut down. So really just checking in listening to individuals, checking in on yourself too. I think that's really important. We're always like, check in on your strong friend, but we also need to check in on self as well. And really just paying attention to how people are showing up in this current state. And sometimes it means just sitting with them, being silent, offering real help. And that can be like, hey, I'll pay for a therapy session. Or, hey, I have these resources. I know about the Washington Therapy Fund Foundation. Or I know about Beam or Open Path Collective. These are some things that we can do, but really getting outside of ourselves and really paying attention to what's happening to those closest to us. How are our kids right now? Because we're all experiencing the coronavirus pandemic. We're all in it. And sometimes we become so consumed with self that we forget to look at the outside world, and sometimes they feel forgotten or alone. And there's so many people who live in a house full of people and feel alone. So just checking in.
Well, I think you just mentioned something too, because you answered my second question there about like what are some of the things that loved ones can do. So thank you for incorporating that as well, because I think that a lot of folks really don't understand some of those pathways. So maybe you can expand a little bit more on some of those resources that you just mentioned with regard to really getting family members the help that they need.
Yeah, so just expanding on more in terms of what family and friends can do is offering, that real sustainable help, sharing their experiences. Like, hey, we know a lot of people are unemployed right now. Maybe if you're the person who's working and you've lost a job before, sharing your experience and what helped for you, or just talking about it like, hey, I know what it's like to experience a loss. Just checking in and showing up, paying attention to people's responses. And it's very important as a friend or a family member to not hop into fix-it mode. Some of us have pleasing personalities, and we just want to fix things. I'm a solution-focused therapist, so I'm always looking at what is the solution. But sometimes the solution is just to listen and not try to fix it, because it comes off extremely judgmental. And sometimes that person may just want to, speak these things like, hey, I've been having these thoughts. It doesn't mean that they actively want to harm themselves. It's important to follow up with like, well, hey, do you have a plan? Then that's key. Like, okay, we're getting a little closer to actually getting to suicide, but versus them just sharing, I just feel like I don't want to be here. This world is messed up. We just seen the Capitol get bombarded. A lot of different things that can be very triggering, especially to Black peoples, when we just protested and were met with tear gas and guns and all kinds of things that these other people weren't met with. So reconciling that and just showing up. So just your presence, oftentimes more than not, your presence means more than anything.
Yeah, and also too, the great thing is that there really are some real resources out there, right? I mean, you mentioned Washington Therapy Fund, which thank you for doing that. I mean, you can expand on that, but I think you also said pathways. There's some real resources when it comes to like, look, I know that my family member is in need. I know that they won't go to someone who's white. They're looking for, a Black therapist. They're looking for somebody who looks like them, and when a family member has that genuine concern, there's actually spaces they can go.
Yeah, so I can definitely talk about the Washington Therapy Fund, which I founded in an effort to provide free therapy to Black people here in Washington State. Because with the coronavirus, I just seen an uptick in individuals reaching out for therapy, stressed out. Then we add the George Floyd protest, and then we add unemployment, and individuals didn't have the funds to pay for therapy. And then I also had a lot of white allies asking me, how can they show up? How can they support Black peoples during this time? And I was like, well, you know what? You can pay for their therapy. That's a starting step. And we've been able to pay for over 100 people to receive 4 to 6 free therapy sessions. And there's other organizations doing similar things on a national level, like the Loveland Foundation, that's one, Taraji P. Henson's foundation, which I love that right now she's campaigning to get more Black men in therapy and paying for Black men to receive therapy. There's Beam, there's the Open Path Collective, which it's for individuals who can pay between $30 to $50 a session so that you can get therapy at a reduced rate. And then we also have amazing community health agencies here locally that work on a sliding scale or free to no cost, things like Sound Mental Health, NAVOs. You know, we also have the 211 number that provides crisis counseling and can get you hooked up to a counselor in your area. So there's plenty of resources, but not enough. So there can be more. And I know oftentimes it's difficult finding a clinician, especially a clinician of color, here locally. So that may mean finding other avenues or finding a different type of clinician or a different type of support. You know, we talked about Reiki, acupuncture, incorporating all of these things. If you're faith-based, you know, your spiritual leader, incorporating your spiritual practices. Showing up to group events, group meetings, things like that. Lots of things are happening on Zoom.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Sometimes I've even said, because you were talking about this earlier, the isolation is real, particularly right now. And so meetup groups are still a thing. And I think that even when you have, you know, because sometimes it's about Zoom doom, you know, it's like, oh, not another Zoom, not another Zoom. But when you go away from, you know, hey, this is my Zoom for work, I'm having to show up with my work hat on, versus this is a Zoom where I can just vibe out with folks that actually share a common, you know, hobby of mine, or, you know, folks who have my same political view even, right? Like, oh, in this space, I get to really release a lot of other things. And I think that sometimes the diversification of how we're actually connecting right now is super key, because yeah, a lot of us have to be on Zoom for work or whatever else, or the kids with Zoom for school. But I do think that, you know, in terms of other kind of community groups and social groups, you can be on Zoom for something else that has nothing to do with those topics. And it really allows you to actually still share in some camaraderie, you know, around something else. And is that one of the things that folks can be doing right now to like get themselves kind of out of that isolation?
Yeah, another good one that I've been seeing has been Clubhouse. And so you don't necessarily have to, you know, be sitting at a computer or be dressed up or having people ask you to turn your camera on, because it's all based through the phone. And there's all these very big group support chats geared around mental health. Some I seen were just processing the stressors of what happened at the Capitol. Some were processing television shows, the end of power. So there's plenty of different things geared around, you know, business, entertainment, just fun, laughter. So I would also encourage people to participate in Clubhouse and find other creative ways to engage at a safe distance and just being mindful of your own health and others' health. So there's ways that we can connect, because we were meant to connect.
Yeah, I mean, really, we were meant to connect. And that brings me back down to, you know, the family ties. And that's something that we're really going to get into in our last segment, because I think that leading up to it, there's a lot. When we talked about earlier, survivor's guilt. I just want you to be able to just give our audience a brief description of really what survivor's guilt is before we take our next break.
Yeah, so survivor's guilt is really this feeling that many of us have that we could have stopped what occurred, that we could have saved person. In terms of suicide survivor's guilt, it's like, well, if I would have seen the signs, if I could have paid for therapy, or I should have showed up more, I should have known. So survivor's guilt is really this internal remorse that we feel that we could have actually helped the situation, and then we're placing their actual death on our shoulders. And then what that does is it sends signals to our brain to say, hey brain, you know what, you could have helped. And that's when you go into this destructive thinking pattern of the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, and then you become anxious, you become depressed, and then you fall into this bout of having difficulty actually functioning, being able to show up at work, being able to show up to those constant Zoom meetings, since we were just talking about that, being able to show up for your kids, because your mind is trying to process this death that occurred that you feel responsible for, that you felt you could have actually helped. And it's completely normal. Guilt is a normal part of grief. It's something that we experience. But when you see that you are experiencing these thoughts and these behaviors for like 4, 6, 8 weeks, and it's continuing on, then I would encourage you to reach out to a mental health professional.
Well, that is key. I think so many times, you know, maybe even unintentionally or inherently, you know, folks put blinders up, you know, if they feel that they're not adequate enough, prepared enough to deal with the situation that their family member is experiencing. And so there's a level of isolation that even occurs from somebody on the outside looking into the issue of, well, how much do I get involved? I think it goes back to other things too for me when I think about some of those ageisms, some of those mantras that are in our head. Oh, that ain't your business. Oh, stay in your place. Oh, you don't have to worry about that. Don't worry, we got this. That those kind of sentiments that run through our minds and say, well, all right, somebody's got to be handling that. I'm sure I'm not the only one to witness it. Somebody else has got to be handling that. And so that for me is what I also heard too, is that it is important to be able to be the one that does speak up when you see something, and not to be thinking about all of those other things that may be running in your head that stops you. So with that, you guys, we're going to take one more break here. And on the other side of this break, we're going to get into some more of this family discussion around suicide. Thank you. Hi, everyone. If you guys know of a young person, a teenager, youth in your neighborhood, youth that you work with that is experiencing depression or symptoms of suicide, there is direct resources, particularly for younger people. It is something that is wrecking so many different communities when we think about young folks taking their lives. Please direct them to the Teen Link line at 1-866-833-6546. That is 1-866-833-6546. 24/7, they can get help that they need.
I did it for the city, I did it for the love, I did it for the people, I did it for us. Back on this rap-ish, I ain't even broke a sweat, homie, this practice. Pondering my next move, staring at my track list, hope I ain't miss my window. Praying like a Baptist, Seattle's own. Tired of this Game of Thrones. They made a list of the best rappers, and guess who wasn't on? While the disrespect continues, I'm steady packing these venues.
Converge Media produces culturally relevant content for Black and urban audiences. Our coverage is raw, transparent, and objective, praised by community leaders, government officials, and residents. Support Converge Media today via Venmo, CashApp, or PayPal at Converge Media. Welcome back, everybody, to this special broadcast right here on Converge Media. I am your host, Trea Holiday, and joining me today is the Ashley McGirt, MSW and mental health extraordinaire. You really have hit the scene with regard to so many community groups, and thank you, because I've been in calls with you on Saturday mornings. We've been having a Black Health and Wellness work group, really to tackle a lot of the issues that we're talking about today with regard to not only resources that are culturally rooted from our community, but also to really break down a lot of the stigmas around mental health. And suicide is one of those big stigmas. I'll say here that for me, I had two family members back to back in 2010 who actually did commit suicide, one in August and one in October. And it really wrecked my family to a certain degree. And I'm talking to you guys out there because you're not alone if you're somebody who experienced this and wondered, what was it I could do? As Ashley was saying before the break, that survivor's guilt really hits so many of us differently, and particularly in the Black community. Some of the issues that we have arisen right here on this special is that it's not something that's widely discussed. It's not something that's shared in a communal way. It isn't something that folks feel that they can be vulnerable about. And all of those experiences that we have described really went through so many of my family members, wondering why, wondering what I could have done. Hey, I saw the signs. I tried to tell you. I wanted you to understand. Why didn't you just let me do what I said I was going to do with that person? The first suicide that we experienced was my uncle. my Uncle Holiday, who was well known in the community. And his funeral was a real testament to how so many of his loved ones outside of our family, his friends and community, his church members, people that he was on choirs with, people that he worked with, people that he was so close with, how nobody saw this really coming. And it was so shocking to so many of us, because when you have somebody that is so full of life, that goes around, and he is the jokester, he's got the style, he's got the swag, that you didn't see it coming. And sometimes it reminds me of what we saw in celebrity. Even though Robin Williams is white, it reminds me of that, because when you have someone that's like, but you had everything, or we're so filled with love, so this love of abundance of love coming into you and pouring into you. A lot of the times we don't realize how people, again, isolate these feelings, and they do exactly what you said. And I lived that with my uncle. Months before his death, I had gotten married, and he was a part of the wedding. And to be honest, when he committed suicide, for me it was like, whoa, what? And he wrote us a letter, right, to the family, so that we could understand what he had been dealing with on his back for so long. He was able to share that with us. One of the things I want to ask you, when people go through a traumatic experience like this, and they have to pick themselves up from the ground, what is it that you would say to them in terms of ensuring that they take this lesson in and that they begin to move differently because of it?
I would want them to know that it's okay not to be okay. It's extremely, extremely hard to process the loss of a life, especially someone close to you. It was the loss of my grandmother that fuels the work that I do today. And there's not a second that doesn't go by that I don't think about her, or that I don't still miss her, or that I don't get tearful. Grief comes in waves, and you have to acknowledge those feelings. You have to forgive yourself. That's how you get through the guilt, because we're holding on to this guilt and shame for all the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, and we need to forgive ourselves. We also need to forgive the individual who took their life, because sometimes we feel anger and resentment. My grandmother didn't die from suicide, but I was upset. Like, how dare you leave me on earth with these individuals? Look what's going on at the Capitol, and you got me here by myself. So there was just a lot of anger and hurt toward her, toward God, all of these different things that I had to reconcile and forgive. Forgive the healthcare system. Forgive all of these pieces that I felt were a part of her loss. So when you've experienced a loss due to suicide, you have to do that and give yourself the space to really feel those feelings and know, it's okay not to be okay. And there's gonna be hard days. And then you take that experience, and now how can I show up for myself? How can I show up better for the individuals who are still in my life today? How can I take that experience and do better, be better? Because if you fall into this idea of, it's all your fault, and then you're anxious and you're depressed, you're no good to anybody, let alone yourself. So it's really taking those feelings and those experiences to show up better. You show up on these Saturdays and you're a part of these wellness conversations to build up community wellness. You spoke about how you went to therapy and all of these different things that you've done. So I think continuing to share your testimony and share your story, that is so important, especially as Black people, that we share our story and we talk about it. I actually have this t-shirt, I was trying to find it to wear. It says, "This is what depression looks like." And Philip Roundtree, another therapist, he's out in New Jersey, he created it. And it's because we have this mistaken belief of what depression looks like. And so when I wear it, sometimes people are like, what, you're a therapist? You're depressed? Or you could be a depressed person? They don't see that. They don't think that. And when Philip started the movement, he asked individuals what they thought about his mood and his personality. And he's this vibrant, very big, like black guy, fun, he did a TED Talk. It was pretty interesting. And it's all these positive things. And what people don't know is that he had multiple suicide attempts and that he's grappled with depression most of his life. But when you look at him, you don't see depression. Oftentimes, when you look at black men or black women, you don't see depression because we just have to get through it. This is normal day-to-day life for us. And many of us are high functioning, people like your uncle. I relate to that so much because I was extremely depressed when my grandmother died and nobody knew it. I couldn't tell anyone because of the shame and the judgments that they put when I did start to let up on feelings. It's like, well, why are you feeling like that? You're so blessed, you have this in your life, or you have this going on, so you shouldn't be that way, or just pray. And it was just like all of these things that were not in alignment with my feelings, so I kept it inside. And there's so many of us who do that. Or we don't want to be a burden to our family, who we already know is stressed out. You planning a wedding, doing other things. I'm in that process right now, planning a wedding. So I know there may be individuals who don't want to reach out and don't want to bother me. And I try to take that wall down and let people know that it is okay to reach out to me, to ask for support or resources. And so we just need to, break that wall down and let people know it's okay to have these conversations and it's okay to process those feelings. You have to. Otherwise, they'll be stuck in the body and manifest themselves in other ways that are harmful to your health.
Like we were just talking about, I keep thinking about these black women with fibroids. And the second death that was in my family, particularly was my 14-year-old cousin. And it was just months after my uncle. And the truth of the matter is that one was really hard for me in particular. And I really grappled with my anger toward her mother, my anger toward myself, my anger toward, what came out in the letter was maybe she had been molested, and it was like, oh my God, did we not see that? So my anger toward that person that was close to our family at the time as well. And when you think about it, a lot of it it hits differently when it's a young person. And so my next question to you really goes towards the young people that are now saying, you know what, this is not, I don't want to be here. This is, not what I want to do. And how do people that are trying to support their lives and their lived experience, how do they support the younger people who have these ideas? Because I think what you said really struck me as well. A lot of the times the older folks will say, hey, you're blessed. You should, get over it. Hey, trust me, pray with me, come to church. And sometimes those things don't actually really hit the core. Yeah. So, I think some of this is just about opening up so that young people can feel that they do have safe spaces to even be able to explain their feelings.
Exactly. You hit it right on the nail. And I feel like sometimes older people will be like, you haven't even lived enough of life to be depressed. What are you talking about? As if their youthfulness negates them from these experiences and these feelings of depression just because they haven't made it to 30, 40, 60 years old, whatever the case may be, in terms of how they're placing a context of what it takes to be able to experience depression. You need to get to this age first. Because the reality is our young people are extremely depressed, and people begin to start thinking about suicide from the age of 6 years old. And we see this. We've seen our young people take their lives. And so we need to, as adults and as elders, create a safe space for them to process their feelings without shame or guilt. And for those of us who are parents, recognize not everything can be received by us. Sometimes we need to bring in someone else who they can receive the information from, whether it be a cousin, a peer, a friend. If you're recognizing some of these signs and symptoms that we spoke about earlier in your youth or in your children, and you're talking to them and they're not opening up, it doesn't mean they don't love you. It just means sometimes it takes someone else to open that door and start that conversation. And maybe it's another young person who speaks openly about their experiences and is okay sharing that. Maybe it's showing them a video, but providing the information from an external source that is not self. I'm a therapist, and some of the things that I say, my family will not receive. So I'll bring in one of my therapist friends, or I'll share a video. I just did a video with Dr. Katrina Sanford, and we were both talking about racial trauma. And my mom was like, I love that, Dr. Katrina. And I was like, she's saying everything I've been saying to you, but okay, I'm glad you love her. I will let her know. And it was interesting because we both said the same exact thing in the video, and my mom was just so overwhelmed with the way that she received it. She's like, racial trauma, that's what I've been experiencing at work. I'm like, Mom, I've been telling you that's racial trauma at work, but it's okay. I just laughed about it and I didn't take it personal. So I recognize that there's just things that cannot be received by me because I'm always going to be daughter, baby, sister, whatever the case may be. And so when we're having these conversations about suicide, don't take it personal, and just know that it's okay to bring in an expert, bring in a family member, share a video or share another resource, and even talk openly with your children. Like, share your experiences. My fiance's son, someone just committed suicide at his school a couple months ago. And so we had a conversation with him, and I asked him openly, like, have you ever had these thoughts or these types of feelings? And the reality was there were times when he had. And my fiance was just mind blown. So we never really think or know that it could be someone in our family until we start the conversation. And so unfortunately, it was someone at his school completing suicide that started that conversation, but it started it. And so we have to continue it and not stop it. Just because this is an hour segment or whatever the case may be, it doesn't mean once this is done, we stop talking about suicide.
Right, and you're absolutely right. And even in my own experiences, there was my uncle, a proud gay black man who was loved from, the rooter to the tutor when it comes to his family. I mean, when it comes to the community, people all around him, he was really beloved, kind of bigger than life, larger than life character, but a black man yet the same. And so the stigmas around why black men are committing suicide, why young people are committing suicide. As we just heard there in the break, 68% here we're seeing in suicide deaths is still the number 3rd reason for death. I mean, these are still high statistics. And you were saying that it's been the 3rd reason for death, really, since you were really studying. But the why of this is really important. And those 2 examples, just from my own personal experience, a lot of the times there's a stigma around, hey, young people have all of their whole lives ahead of them, and and black men are the strongest characters on the planet, right? And so I really want to get from you a bit of the whys. Again, going back to why does this even exist, and it's still really persistent in black community?
Yeah. So there's a number of different reasons why people complete suicide, but essentially it goes back to depression. Many of us have a history of depression. We're suffering from depression internally. Black men and other people within the Black community often feel extremely hopeless. And when you're hopeless and you feel like there is no other alternative, then sometimes that means that you're thinking about, well, I want to leave this earth. Death has to be better than this. There has to be something better than what I'm experiencing. And you feel like there's nothing that can fix the situation. So maybe you lost a job, you lost your spouse, or something. You feel like you cannot go on without that person. You feel like you cannot go on without that job. So when you become hopeless is a very dangerous, destructive thought pattern that torments individuals. And then you get stuck there. Or worse, when you feel like you're burdening your family. Oftentimes individuals who have ailments where they're relying on their family members to care for them feel like, you know what, I'm a burden to them because they have to work their job, come home, try to care for me. I have this illness that's not going away, and I see them struggling, so life would be better off if I weren't here. And that's not true. Because your family member gets up every day, goes to work, takes care of you, does all of those things because they love you. And it does more harm for you to leave this earth. So really, a lot of times it's just that hopelessness. And that's why we need to have these conversations, let people know they're loved. Not every family member is a physical. They don't always give hugs. I didn't really come from a family that was like a hugger, but we were verbal. So it's like, I love you. You don't gotta touch me. And it's coronavirus right now, so don't touch me. There's some families who it's just like, love up on people. So however the case may be, and if you do come from a family like me and not really want to be touchy-feely, still creating space to be touchy-feely, because having a hug does something to the body. It increases serotonin levels. Like, it does something for you to be physically embraced by another person, another being. So really just loving people, which sometimes that's hard right now in this season of COVID, and don't touch me, back up 6 feet. But it's like, how can we show that love and still feel the physical warmth? I can still feel the warmth of your body at a distance. I know that I'm here with you. And then I remember all of these fond memories when we were at Soap Lake and all of the fun things that we've done. So just being in the presence, it triggers these positive memories. Going back, looking at photo albums, remembering things. That's why it's so important to take photos. I'm always taking pictures of things, and it's because it triggers positive memories, especially when we get to a space in life where maybe we're experiencing dementia or Alzheimer's. It can send reminders. So just constantly take photos and be around those that you love, however you can in this season. But yeah, so those are the things that I would say, and just try to get out of that hopelessness, because that hopelessness is a killer.
There's definitely been a lot of, I think, evidence-based research to really highlight everything that you just said with regard to, really depression being the number one cause that leads to suicide, right? Is that it's almost hard to see suicide without depression. It's almost like, two sides of the same coin. But, you mentioned something there with regard to COVID. One thing that, I think a lot of people forget about is just smiling. If you start Googling smiling and the effects that smiling has, as you said, on the serotonin levels, on the body, on the mind, on your psyche, and also triggering those kind of joyful and happy experiences and expressions just simply through kind of even smiling through stuff. That's why folks that, say, I had to smile to keep from crying, right? But really, that's a real thing. And there's evidence-based research to indicate that that is real. I saw you go, yes.
Yeah, because it reminded me of this story, a quick little story that I have to tell you. So there's this movie called The Bridge. It's a documentary about suicides. Individuals, they go to this bridge in San Francisco to kill themselves. It's like the most popular bridge for suicide. And I was watching the documentary, and one of the gentlemen, Kevin Hines, he went there and he said before he chose to kill himself, if somebody smiles at me, if somebody says hello to me, I won't do it. This man hopped on a city bus, walked all around the city. Not one person smiled at him. Not one person said hello to him. And so he went to the bridge and he attempted to kill himself. And now he survived. He's able to tell the story. And it's interesting because he said that when he jumped, he broke his back. All of these things happened to this man, but there were seals surrounding him, encircling him. Until this day, he believes that it was God. But he survived to tell his story and actually lived. But it just goes to tell you how important it is to smile and say hello, because he said internally, if someone smiles at me, that means my life is worth living. But not one person smiled at him, and it took him hours because he was going back and forth debating with himself on whether or not he should attempt suicide. And he's like, you know what? Not one person on this earth even thinks that I matter. They didn't look at him, and eventually he did it. And so, yeah, it's so profound when you watch that documentary and you hear his story and his testimony.
That actually leads me into one of my final questions for you, honestly, is with regard to suicide attempts. You just mentioned it there, but I think that there's also statistics around when someone attempts suicide and they don't go through with it, it doesn't actually take their lives. What do we see in terms of statistics of then that person being able to be whole again, right? To remedy their situation? Is that sometimes the wake-up call that is needed for some folks to be like, whoa, wait a minute. I tried it, yet I survived it. There's a reason for my existence.
Yeah. And each person is different. Plenty of people have multiple suicide attempts. I believe the research says like person has like 20 plus suicide attempts. And they survive, and they still continue to go down this pattern depending upon the type of help that they receive or the lack thereof. And so sometimes it takes quite a bit of time. Even Kevin Hines, the gentleman I mentioned in the documentary, said that was not his last suicide attempt. And he still struggles till this day with depression, but he has an accountability partner, an accountability team who helps hold him accountable to stay alive here on earth. People who didn't know he was struggling before. So like his family, his friends, his peer groups who check in on him and make sure that he's okay and he's doing well so that he doesn't attempt suicide again. For some individuals, they have one attempt and, maybe have to get their stomach pumped or something really profound happens that wakes them up and it's like, no, I'm not doing that again. That was pretty scary. Or, something happened. So each person is different when it comes to suicide attempts. I really want to change those numbers. I want, of course, I don't want anyone to attempt suicide, but if there are individuals who have attempted, I hope that they never attempt again.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the key factor too is, not only is it just dealing with all of the issues that come, but hey, there is a reason for your life. There's a reason for your existence, and people really being able to find their purpose, I think, is so key. So a lot of people are really like either in jobs that they don't love or, doing things that they don't love, and it really does, I think, allow these kind of ideals to perpetuate in folks' minds. But before we let you go, we got to ask, as a therapist, how can someone who may be looking for services, how can they reach out to you? I know the last time your calendar was booked, but always want to ask how folks can actually reach out to you.
Yeah, so you can reach out to me on ashleymcgirt.com or most social media platforms at Therapy with Ash. That's going to be the best way to find me.
Thank you again, Ashley. This has been phenomenal for our community, and again, something that does not get discussed enough. Over here at Converge, we're always trying to make sure that we're keeping our community educated and informed. We saw an increase, a spike almost in suicides with regard to COVID, so it was another issue that we really had to bring you in on, and we really appreciate you coming to the studio today to lend your expertise to this subject matter. And for those of you that are out there, there are plenty of resources that Ashley did go over today. One of the most common ones is 211. If you're really looking for help, if you think a family member is in need, there are so many different resources there. There are suicide prevention sites that you can go on. There are also other kinds of emergency numbers that you can call 24/7. And 211 is a great stop for you to figure out what those resources are. From our family right here at Converge, this is important to us, and we wanted to make sure that you guys were informed and had the resources that were needed. We thank you for watching this special right here on Converge. Thank you again, Ashley. This has been phenomenal.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Yeah, we really hope that you guys enjoyed this special and that you guys have been highlighted and informed in terms of suicide prevention. Thank you for joining us. Hi, everyone. With suicide being such a major issue, there are many resources that are out there to protect ourselves, our families, and our youth from going through suicide. There are different websites that I want to bring to your attention right now. Suicide Prevention Lifeline.org is a national website for you to direct anyone across the nation that you feel may be experiencing the symptoms of suicide. There's a way that they can be helped 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Clearly, this is something that has taken effect into so many different communities, and the importance of it is felt from a national all the way to a county level. There are definitely resources out here, and primarily for anyone who is experiencing thoughts of depression or thoughts of suicide. Please utilize these websites and make sure that you have the help that you need.